End extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity on a livable planet. That is the mission of the World Bank Group. Achieving lasting poverty reduction depends, among other things, on sustainable natural resource management. And that brings us to our next speaker, Carolyn Fischer, lead economist at the World Bank. She is a part of the World Bank's Planet Research Program, which offers policy insights on a wide range of issues spanning from the environment via biodiversity to climate change. And in her research, Carolyn Fischer focuses on environmental policy design. Today, she will offer us insights into the global drivers of low-carbon competitiveness and the investment landscape in green-compatible versus fossil-reliant capital in developing economies. Usually based in Washington, D.C., she has crossed the Atlantic to be with us today, and she has also a spot in the expert panel. But right now, she is entering the stage for us, so please welcome Carolyn Fischer.
Thanks. It's very nice to be here. Let me just give a quick disclaimer. I'm sort of here as a researcher with experience at the World Bank and not necessarily representing the World Bank or its board of directors. So I'm going to take a little bit more of a long view here and state, the energy transition is already underway, as we heard from Svieta's presentation just now. We track the different sustainable development goals, and the indicators relate to energy access and renewable energy. And we see, around the world there are many major economies that have already installed a great deal of renewable energy capacity per capita, and then a lot of economies that have, a majority even of their total energy consumption is from renewables. So one of the reasons I think this is going to be hard to stop is because of the evolution of renewable energy technologies. Just in the past 15 years, these costs have come down dramatically, and so now, at least in the power sector, renewables are the most cost competitive option. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't still challenges. There's still challenges related to power markets, designing them well and functional, enabling the ability to integrate more renewables and to incentivize not only capacity expansion, but also dispatch with renewable energy first. Improving cost recovery and the grid, all while expanding access in a lot of countries. So in developing countries, though, there is a challenge in that developing countries need to finance more of these capital investments, and the weighted average cost of capital, I guess that's the WACC up there, is much higher in these countries. So you see, in the lower left-hand quadrant, those are mostly advanced economies, and then as you get up to the upper right-hand quadrant, those are developing countries. They have much higher costs of capital. And we also see this on average for renewable energy, which is more capital intensive than conventional sources. The capital costs can be quite higher than those in advanced economies. So that's a challenge we need to tackle in terms of de-risking finance, concessional finance, blended finance, and targeted interventions to help make sure that developing economies can take advantage of the tremendous technological progress so they don't have to develop in the same way that industrialized economies did in the past. Now, there's also trade. Trade can be helpful for the transition. So certainly, there's a lot of trade in these technologies, but there are still a fair amount of barriers to trade in green value chains. So this is from a study by one of my colleagues in the research group, looking at an example of 35 emerging markets and their policies in terms of the tariffs that are applied to electric vehicles, and also solar and wind technologies, and also non-tariff barriers. These, remain significant, and they can be higher than other conventional goods. And so my colleagues find that actually firms' response to these tariffs, their import response, is more sensitive in these green value chains than in conventional products. So these sort of findings indicate that governments in emerging markets should be very careful and not try to follow in the more protectionist industrial policy attempts of advanced economies, because their local firms really rely on imports in the short term to help aid diffusion of these green technologies. Trade also much more broadly shapes energy choices around the world. And in particular, I do a lot of research on emissions-intensive industries, so heavy industries. They're going to be very sensitive to energy costs, emissions regulations, and also the evolution of market demand. So we see now, fossil price volatility, energy cost volatility is going to add some extra impetus for efficiency and also to look at alternative energy sources. A challenge, though, is that if these price shocks are not commonly shared, then they have the potential to really shift relative competitiveness and change and add tensions in what's already a very tense industries. Think steel, aluminum, etc., fertilizers. At the same time, there is, though, growing demand for goods produced with lower carbon footprints, with less embedded emissions, including through the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is coming online this year. And so this is requiring importers in the EU of goods from these emissions-intensive industries, steel, cement, fertilizer, aluminum, and a couple others, to have to pay for their embedded emissions in the same way that EU producers have to pay for their emissions under the EU emissions trading system. So this is one of many drivers that are indicating that decarbonization in the long run is going to be an essential component of competitiveness in these markets and in growing markets globally. Now, we also see, and partly in response to these drivers and to the CBAM, but also for local reasons, domestic ambitions, and co-benefits, there is really growing coverage of carbon pricing and emissions regulation around the world in power and industrial sectors. So some of my colleagues at the bank, we have a carbon pricing dashboard, and each year they produce the state and trends of carbon pricing. And now we have 80 different carbon pricing instruments that have been implemented worldwide, so more jurisdictions have carbon pricing. Importantly, all large middle-income countries have either implemented or are seriously considering direct carbon pricing. So this is really an evolution. Already, a little more than half of all emissions from the power sector worldwide are covered by either a carbon tax or emissions trading system, and over 40% of industrial emissions. Okay, a lot of this is the EU and the Chinese nationwide emissions trading system, but also several other countries and more coming online. So we see there's great progress in this area and commitment to tackling emissions, although obviously there's still a lot of variation in the sort of prices and stringency, but I think this shows great promise. The EU emissions trading system has taken a couple decades to get where it is. So there's a foundation that's expanding worldwide. And then finally, I want to make the point that, the vast majority of the world is still committed to the transition. So we have net zero targets that cover 77% of global emissions. This is even with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement and abandoning these targets, but arguably temporarily, because a new administration may come along and come back in, so we need to think in the future. And so, these are very broad commitments that, that reflect, this expectation that we will transition to clean energy sources, and, we need to, keep our eye in the future and make sure that the policies and actions and mechanisms keep us on track despite short-term challenges. So thank you very much.